Hello, my name is Michael Taylor, the director of the Hood Museum of Art at Dartmouth College, and it gives me immense pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's lecture, which is being given by Barbara Mundy. This talk is the third in a series of annual lectures that revolve around topics and themes related to the epic of American civilization, the internationally recognized mural by Jose Clemente Orozco that is located in the reserve reading room of Dartmouth's Baker-Berry Library. These lectures have been made possible by an endowment funded by the MANTON Foundation, which promotes scholarship on and provides conservation for the Orozco mural at Dartmouth. We would like to express our sincere gratitude to the MANTON Foundation, which through a separate grant also made possible the new lighting scheme for the mural that was completed to great success in the fall of 2012. This afternoon, we celebrate another important milestone, the conferring of National Historic Landmark status to the epic of American civilization mural by the National Park Service. Immediately after today's lecture, I invite you to walk over to the library's Orozco room to attend the unveiling of a bronze plaque provided by the Park Service that marks this new and historic designation, and also to join us afterwards for a reception in the west wing of the main corridor of the Baker-Berry Library. We are very pleased that we have a representative of the MANTON Foundation board with us here today, Sandra Morton-Niles, Dartmouth class of 1990. Would you please stand up? And we also have a representative of the National Park Service, Rick Kendall, who is the superintendent of the St. Gaudens National Historic Site in nearby Cornish, New Hampshire. Rick, may you stand up if he's here. There he is. So I have two more things to do. One is to tell you to turn your cell phones off, and I have to make a note to tell myself to turn mine off. And secondly, to introduce my great friend and colleague, Mary Coffey, who is an associate professor of art history and chair of the art history department of Dartmouth, who will introduce this afternoon's speaker, Barbara Mundy. Professor Coffey was the inaugural speaker in the MANTON lecture series and is currently writing a much anticipated book about the Orozco mural at Dartmouth. As an expert on Orozco and Mexican art and culture, she has served as a tremendous advisor to this lecture series and was instrumental in bringing Professor Mundy to Dartmouth. Please welcome Mary Coffey.
Hi, welcome. And I want to join Michael in really expressing my gratitude to the MANTON Foundation, which has been wonderful to me in particular, but also to the institution, and really wonderful to Orozco. And it's really wonderful to see Sandy again every year. It's been great to see her for this wonderful event. I'm really pleased to be introducing and welcoming Barbara Mundy to campus for this event. We already spent a couple hours together today having lunch, and then we were in the Orozco corridor looking at the mural and talking about it. We were so engrossed that I lost track of time and was late to a student appointment. But just on the basis of that little bit of time we spent together looking at the mural together, I know tonight's lecture is going to be excellent, really fascinating. I also want to acknowledge and note that I have two classes full of students here tonight for the event, and in particular I've got at least 14 first-year students here who for whatever reason decided to spend the term studying Orozco, and so this is going to be really wonderful for them. And I also have a group of students who are studying 20th century art in Latin America, and we've just spent the last week or so looking at a variety of artistic approaches to indigenism in the early 20th century, in the teens, 20s, and 30s. And then in the 40s next week. So they're going to get a lot out of this mural, or out of this talk as well. So one of the goals of the MANTON Foundation Orozco lecture is to encourage scholarship on or related to the Orozco murals. But another is to expand that scholarship beyond the purview of art historians who work on Mexican muralism, like myself or the previous speaker. Therefore, we've been eager to invite a speaker working in either pre-Columbian or colonial periods to generate new insights and approaches to the epic of American civilization. As one of the foremost scholars of both indigenous and colonial cultural production in the early colonial period, Barbara Mundy came to mind immediately. And then I had the pleasure of speaking on a panel with her this past fall, and I knew then that she would be an ideal speaker for this event. For her presentation there demonstrated the same qualities of her writing, which is an enviable combination of erudition, great depth of knowledge, mixed with a liveliness and lucidity that makes these distant topics seem both proximate and accessible to a broad audience. This skill is likely related to her experience in both academic publishing and the digital humanities, and I'm sure it will be on display this evening. Barbara Mundy is an associate professor of art history at Fordham University. She received her Ph.D. in the history of art from Yale University. She's written widely on the cartography of the indigenous peoples of Mexico, and her book, The Mapping of New Spain, published by the University of Chicago Press in 1996, was awarded the Nebenzal Prize in the history of cartography that year. She also contributed to the path-breaking series, The History of Cartography, which received the American Historical Association's James Henry Breasted Prize in 1999. And she also studies the art and visual culture produced in Spain's colonies and is co-author with Diana Liebson of a website and DVD on the subject. The title of that project is Vistas, Visual Culture in Spanish America from 1520 to 1820. And that was published by the University of Texas Press in 2010. It's also available to the public on a website. The address is www.smith.edu/vistas, and you should check it out. In 2012, she and her co-editor Mary Miller published an interdisciplinary study of a rare indigenous map called Painting a Map of 16th Century Mexico City, Land, Writing, and Native Rule. This was published by Yale University Press. And she's just completed a book on, and this is the project that I'm most excited about, a book on the city of Tenochtitlan, Mexico City, as it was transformed from the Aztec imperial capital into the center of the Spanish viceroyalty. In this project, she looks not only at maps, but also the ecology and ritual life of the city. This book is forthcoming in 2014 with the University of Texas Press, and it's titled The Death of Aztec Tenochtitlan, The Life of Mexico City. So I'm eager to get Barbara to the podium so she can share her insights and knowledge with you. So please join me in giving her a really warm welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Mary. That was a lovely introduction. And thank you very much to the Hood Museum for inviting me here, and also to the MANTON Foundation for their generous support of this lecture series, and for their support of the Orozco murals. There we go. Jose Clemente Orozco is known to us today as one of los tres grandes, or the three big ones, among Mexican artists of the 20th century. His compatriots were Diego Rivera, seen here, and David Siqueiros. Beginning in 1922, they set out to paint in fresco great public murals in Mexico City. Many of these murals survive, and their influence on Mexican art today is undeniable. If the early 1920s saw Orozco making his mark as a Mexican painter, by 1927, he would seek to break out of that mold. In this year, he moved to the United States, and here he began to stretch beyond the Mexican experience. In the United States, he was invited to paint at the New School, and here his imagery grew more and more internationalist, speaking to broad themes of social justice and human rights. We see these concerns in this important New School mural cycle, completed right before the Dartmouth one. Here, Orozco based the content of the work on three universal themes. The first was the creative abilities of man, and is shown in this part of the mural by the figures of the scientist on the left and the artist on the right. They greet one outside the entrance to the room. The second theme, the proletariat struggle, is shown here inside the room by Maya peasants and Soviet armies under Lenin on the east wall, which you see above. Below, its triumph comes on the south wall, where the worker returns home to abundantly well-fed and well-read family. The third theme, human brotherhood, captured on the opposite wall, where here figures from all nations gather around the table of brotherhood. Although by 1930, Orozco had left Mexico, Mexico never left Orozco. Following his invitation to Dartmouth to paint murals in May of 1932, he set out a part of a dramatic scene which would become, eventually, the departure of Quetzalcoatl. Orozco was haunted not by modern Mexico. Instead, he was haunted by Mexico's Aztec past. The Aztecs were the last of the great indigenous empires of the Americas, but the arrival of Spanish conquistadors in 1519 brought that empire to an end. The Aztecs were gone, but they left in their wake a terrible reputation. They were and they are famed for their bloodthirsty practice of human sacrifice and cannibalism. And these practices appear in great gory detail in Orozco's mural. So given Orozco's international bent in the early 1930s, why would he return to dwell on the pre-Hispanic and Aztec past? Why did this history, almost like the subconscious traumas of one's childhood, refuse to go away? What did the Aztecs mean to Orozco? And what can the inclusion of the Aztec past in this history of America teach us today? These are three questions I'll set out to answer in my talk today. In 1890, the Orozco family left their native Guadalajara and moved to Mexico City, the nation's capital. At that time, Mexico City was being transformed into a very modern Latin American city. Elegant orchestral halls and modern department stores were to be found on the streets of the city. Colonies of Americans and German entrepreneurs clustered in other parts of the city, including on this street, Gante Street. And a great network of train tracks covered the vast national territory, connecting it to the world beyond. But if you've ever been to or lived in Mexico City, you'll know that the past is never that distant. And that past is an Aztec past. The map on the right shows the urban sprawl of Mexico City captured in Google Maps today. The map on the left is one by the brilliant artist Thomas Filginger, and he's reconstructed what lay beneath. You can see, and this is why Google Maps is so terrific, you can see the sprawl of the city and all of these, the kind of ghostly sprawl. That's the huge sprawl of Mexico City. And what Tomas has done here is he's picked out where the Great Lake once filled the city, and here is the city in which the Aztec rule of Tenochtitlan. This is the subject of my new book out in the fall, this ghostly city that lies beneath. Now, the city of Aztec Tenochtitlan had been famed as an urban paradise. A painting now in Mexico City's Museo Nacional de Antropología by Luis Covarrubias captures the jewel-like beauty of the city. When the Spaniard Hernando Cortés first entered the city in 1519 as the guest of its emperor Moctezuma, he wrote admiringly of the city to his king. He told of a market square twice as big as the Spanish Salamanca, where 60,000 people came to trade, of the clean canals that crisscrossed the city, of the prosperity and the order that its inhabitants enjoyed. The city had been built on a shallow lake, an inland sea with no outlets. The painting captures the relationships between this pre-Hispanic city of Tenochtitlan and the surrounding environment. Seen from a bird's eye view from the west, the island city dominates the surrounding lake, anchored to its shores by the thin filaments of causeways. At the city center are the imposing buildings of the sacred precinct, with temples rising from spacious plazas. Around the lake are the spent volcanic cones, and beyond them, the great mountains of the valley dominating the eastern horizon line, their snow-capped peaks jutting into the sky. The jagged profiles of this ring of mountains were very much in evidence in the city that Orozco knew. Most retained their names in Nahuatl, the language spoken by the Aztecs, and indeed still to be heard in Orozco City, Cuauhtepetl, Popocatépetl, Ixtaccíhuatl. From this island seat, Aztec warriors had fanned out across Mexico, and by the early 16th century, they had an enormous tributary empire seen in this map in purple. This provincial network fed the center. So successful was the imperial expansion that the urban population of the Valley of Mexico, with Tenochtitlan as its center, was one of the largest urban complexes in the world at the dawn of the 16th century. It had an estimated 150,000 people. This put it on par with some of the larger of its European contemporaries, often exceeding them. Paris was larger, Naples was the same size, Seville and Rome much smaller. The terrible mar to the beauty of this enormous city was the practice of human sacrifice. The conquistador Hernán Cortés described the shrines at the tops of the pyramids as full of the blood of those sacrifices. The need for human victims was one of the engines of Aztec military expansion, as each new campaign brought back defeated enemy warriors to be sacrificed at the central temples. On the left, you see Orozco's imagining of the sacrifices, and on the right, an image from a book meant to explain Aztec culture, painted by Aztec artists some 2 generations after the conquest. The Spanish conquistadors, and certainly the Catholic priests who came in their wake, saw sacrifices as the work of the devil, a violation of the most central of the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not kill. In fact, Aztec practices of human sacrifice were one of the justifications Spaniards used to claim legal right in the wars of conquest, and as well as in their domination of the American continent. In 1521, some 15 months after their first arrival into Tenochtitlan, Spanish forces laid siege to the city. Upon surrender of the Aztec ruler on August 13th, 1521, Spanish soldiers went after native priests. They executed them, sometimes setting their dogs on them to maul them to death. When they couldn't dismantle the pyramids, upon which the sacrificial rituals took place at first, they either destroyed the shrines at top, sometimes replacing the cult statues with in the shrines with the images of the Virgin Mary. Human sacrifice was deeply troubling to Spanish conquistadors and to the priests that followed them. But even more so was the barbaric Eucharist that it entailed. After Aztec warriors would bring war captives to be sacrificed, their families would gather to cook and eat the thigh of the victim. This was a highly formalized ritual, and Aztec families wept with the knowledge that their own young soldier could share the same fate. On the screen, I'm showing you a painting of a similar ritual derived from an Aztec manuscript painted after the conquest. Men and women gather in front of a temple dedicated to the god Mictlantecutli, the underworld deity, and they eat of the victim whose head, arm, and head can be seen in the pots. Today, we have a somewhat more nuanced understanding of the practice and better understand its circumscribed nature. Since human sacrifice was one of the reasons that the Spaniards held as justifying their bloody conquest, Spanish accounts tend, in my view, to overstate the case. A Catholic priest, Diego Duran, recorded that 40,000 sacrificial captives were trotted up the steps of the main temple of Tenochtitlan in the late 15th century at its dedication ceremony. For me, an unbelievable number. Today, that main temple is the site of a major archaeological project. And in this imaginary reconstruction, you can see the main temple of the Aztecs rising adjacent to the modern city. The Zocalo, or main plaza, here, is the second largest urban plaza in the world. In this reconstruction, you see only one building of the Aztec complex, but in its day, it had over 70 structures. So that gives you a sense of the enormous spread in the city. Archaeologists have found many cached offerings in this building, some of them containing sacrificial victims. In the caches with those victims, there are usually 3 to 5 people at most, nowhere near the numbers that Spanish sources claim. An anomaly is one cache that has 48 victims of children, and that was a dedication ceremony to the rain god, and it's totally anomalous among all of the caches of the Templo Mayor. Tenochtitlan is also an island on an inland sea, and the kind of widespread sacrifice that on the lines imagined by Catholic priests later on would have presented, at the very least, a terrible disposal problem. So human sacrifice certainly did go on, but its victims were largely drawn from the ranks of enemies and foreigners, and it was probably on a much more limited scale than was imagined in later accounts, with fewer than 10 victims sacrificed on even the most major feasts celebrated in Tenochtitlan. We also have a better understanding of why the Aztecs practiced sacrifice. They lived in a world that was filled with sacred energy. They worshipped many gods, but their densely populated pantheon was not one on the model of the Greeks, where the gods were rather anthropomorphized into individuals with personalities. Rather, the forces of the natural world around them coalesced into deities. Thus, the rain and lightning were personified by the deity Tlaloc, seen here with his typical Google eyes. The forces of death and decay around us at every moment were personified by the deity Mictlantecuhtli, often pictured with a great skull mouth. While different towns and cities had different deity patrons, the most important of all of these deities were 2 male gods, seen at the center of this manuscript page. They were believed to have created the world. As one of the Aztec histories told it, these 2 gods, Quetzalcoatl and Huitzilopochtli, carried the earth goddess, named Tlaltecuhtli, from the sky to below. The source tells us her joints were full of holes of eyes and mouths, with which she gnawed like a savage beast. The 2 gods chained themselves into huge serpents, and one grabbed the earth goddess by the right hand and the left foot, and the other by the left hand and the right foot, and they pulled so they broke her down the middle. The half above the shoulders was the earth, and the other half the sky. After this was done, to repay the earth goddess for the damage that they'd done to her, all the gods descended to console her. One of the consolations offered to the dismembered earth deity was blood offering. But why human sacrifice? According to the Aztecs, human beings possessed a dynamic energy, a life force that they called tonali in Nahuatl, their language. Tonali manifested itself in heat. The lack of tonali explains why corpses are cold. One of the purposes of tonali was to one of the purposes of human sacrifice was to release this vital tonali to reanimate the world, as well as to repay the great debt that the gods had incurred by ripping apart the earth deity. Thus, victims were often made to dance to the point of exhaustion, to heat themselves up and bring their tonali to the surface. They would then be sacrificed, as almost all captives were, as 4 priests held them over a low stone, forcing their sternum upward, and another priest, equipped with a razor-sharp knife made out of obsidian or flint, extracted their hearts. But in all Aztec representations, human sacrifice is a singular and ordered act. Here, in the Florentine Codex, we can see how it has a very particular quadripartite composition. And this is also picked up in another codex here. We don't see any of the qualities that come out in the historical accounts written much later by the Spaniards, who talk about this as a kind of a bloodlust. This particular quadripartite composition we call a quincunx, with 4 exterior parts and 1 in the center, and it's used in images of world ordering. That suggests to me that the Aztecs themselves saw sacrifice as a way of bringing the world back into a balance, into an ordered state. So the artists use a highly ordered, often quadripartite composition, not a disorganized one, to convey the nature of the world ordering event. Now, Orozco drew on an actual Aztec manuscript to create his scene. He both follows the compositional lead, but heightens the gore and the violence. The victim's face is pushed into our space, and the static deity that is the object of the sacrifice wears a vividly colored necklace of what looks like flowers and entrails. For an ambitious artist like Orozco, on a campaign to reach a pan-American audience, this was not an easy history to bring in. As we saw in the earlier murals of the New School, here he avoided the topic altogether. So why did he do it? Why did he choose to begin his epic of the American civilization with the pre-Hispanic and the Aztecs? One clear reason comes from Orozco's residence in Mexico City, the former city of Tenochtitlan. To Orozco, as to other denizens of the city, the Aztec past was always there. First is its geology. In Orozco's day, as today, modern buildings jostled up against 18th century ones in the historic center of the city. But the reminder that this was once a lake bed came then, as today, with a slow and inexorable sinking into Mexico City's notoriously soft ground. I did not take this photograph after a night of tequilas. That's really how it looks. A perceptive viewer would notice another trace of history in the city streets. The city's principal access to Cuba Street was an ancient Aztec causeway into the city. And it was oriented here not to any cardinal direction, but to the rising of the sun on the date of the solar equinoxes. Even today, if you're in Mexico City around March 22nd or September 21st, you might notice the curious phenomena of the ways the streets are perfectly flooded, almost without shadows, by the early rays of the day. Thus, the solar orientation of the Aztec city still endures. If you're a late riser, and say not that attuned to sunrise events, the Aztec past of the city would still have been an eruptive force. Because during those campaigns of destruction of the 16th century, when the architecture was dismantled, a lot of sculpture was simply buried. Some of it was broken, but a great deal was simply turned face down and covered with soil. Thus, the experience of living in Mexico City, as Orozco did in his youth, was to experience this past constantly churning up to the surface. Such was the case of 2 of the greatest monoliths we know of Aztec sculpture, the Calendar Stone and the Coatlicue, seen in this image. These 2 were dug up in the city's great central plaza, the Zocalo, in 1791. Notably, the Coatlicue, on the right, the earth deity, was the model for the figure in the back of Orozco's sacrificial scene. We see the same necklace here here's this human hands and hearts, and he's done a kind of mashup there. We see the same broad shoulders there. But the Coatlicue has two serpents coming together to create this monstrous face, and he's replaced that with a more readable figure, probably from a little ceramic figurine. Even today, Aztec sculpture is always turning up in Mexico City, and residents of the city are perpetually coming across smaller things, ceramic figurines or shards of polychrome pottery, wherever they scratch the surfaces around them. In other words, no matter how much in the city's history these tokens of the Aztec past were broken up or pushed beneath the surface, they refuse to remain there. We can think of the Aztecs a little bit like zombies, refusing to stay dead in the city, their underground presence constantly erupting into the surface. So why did Orozco return to the Aztec past? Living in Mexico City as Orozco did, one could not escape the evidence of this extraordinary past that could erupt onto the surface at any moment. Aztec times came into your times. This brings me to my second question. What did the Aztecs, and Toltecs as we'll see, mean to Orozco? Now, Orozco knew nothing of the Aztec pyramids that had once existed in the city, as Tenochtitlan had been erased. But he did know of others. Some 30 miles from the center of Mexico City was the once great city of Teotihuacan, built and occupied from the 1st century until its abandonment in the 8th century. Its focal point was the Pyramid of the Sun. Until the 20th century, this was the largest man-made construction in the Americas. It's our Great Wall. It helps us answer our second question. While Teotihuacan was not an Aztec city, Orozco assumed, like many others at that moment, that it was a Toltec city, the Toltecs being the precursor to the Aztecs. Under active excavation, when Orozco was living in Mexico City, it showed a wholly positive side of the pre-Hispanic past. Teotihuacan was a highly organized city, one of the largest cities in the world to be built on a grid plan. It was a painted city, with house complexes painted in richly colored frescoes, like the fragments you see here. In its organization and massive pyramids, it served as a model for Aztec Tenochtitlan, when the Aztecs built their city almost 1,000 years later. In fact, the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma would make a ritual pilgrimage out to the ancient abandoned city of Teotihuacan every 80 days. The evidence that was being unearthed daily from Teotihuacan during the 1920s showed more and more the degree of social and cultural organization ancient cities of the Americas had reached. Because of their urban organization, the ambition of their architecture, the extraordinary richness of their sculptural and painted corpus, ancient American civilizations, particularly the Toltecs and their followers, the Aztecs, belonged in world history. So the Dartmouth murals do not mark really a divergence from the international themes Orozco explored 2 years earlier at the New School. Instead, they're an argument for including the history of the Americas as a valuable and necessary part of world history. But Orozco did not paint all of Toltec or Aztec history. Instead, he manipulated the history of one Aztec god to convey a set of universalist themes. Desmond Rochefort has written that the Dartmouth murals are an exploration of the battle between human idealism and human frailty. These two forces, equally strong, are in a locked contest across human history. At times, idealism triumphs. At other times, human frailty wins the day. Unlike his compatriot and rival, Diego Rivera, Orozco did not envision history as leading forward in a march towards an ever-improved future. Instead, he saw it as a cycle, not always a happy one, where idealism was as likely to fail as it was to triumph. Let's look at how this plays out in the Dartmouth murals, and how Orozco sets the Aztecs into this universalizing template. To be able to compose the work across such a large horizontal space, Orozco divided the walls into 24 panels, which all told cover a massive 3,200 square feet. He divided the walls roughly chronologically. Along the western wall, seen above, are the scenes devoted to the pre-Hispanic period of the Americas, when it existed autonomously from Europe. Along the eastern wall, seen below, are the scenes of the Americas as it was shaped by successive waves of immigration to create Hispano-America and Anglo-America. While the pre-Hispanic American continent gave rise to an extraordinary number of ancient civilizations beginning over 3,000 years ago, Orozco was not a historian, but an artist. And so he chose to condense the great and complex cultural panorama of the ancient Americas and center it onto one figure, the figure of Quetzalcoatl. Now, while the Aztecs had a complex pantheon, Quetzalcoatl was one of the most important deities. As we've seen, he was one of those two creator deities that pulled apart the great earth deity to create the world as we know it today. His name in the Nahuatl language comes from Quetzali, a word meaning quetzal feather, and coatl, meaning serpent. Thus it translates into feathered serpent. A great deity, patron of rulers, Quetzalcoatl, or the feathered serpent, is found all over ancient Mexico. In Paris, where Orozco traveled in 1932 during the painting of Dartmouth murals, he may have encountered this extraordinary sculpture where we see a literal embodiment of the feathered serpent. The serpent engulfs a human figure whose face peers out of its open maw. Right there, there's the serpent, and there's the face. This expressing the essence of Quetzalcoatl as a man-god. But while this is an Aztec sculpture from probably Tenochtitlan of the late 15th century, Orozco also knew Quetzalcoatl as being present in the much earlier city of Teotihuacan. At that site, a spectacular temple, totally unique in all of Mesoamerica, or all of ancient Mexico, is decorated with feathered serpents whose heads jut out perpendicularly from the temple front. This had just, its archaeologist had just published explanations of it in 1921 and 1923. In fact, by the 1920s, there was a kind of public fever around Quetzalcoatl. 1923, D.H. Lawrence had published in New York a novel about modern Mexico called The Plumed Serpent. The English translation of Quetzalcoatl, so named because one of its protagonists falls into the grips of a cult-like religion, which in Lawrence's fevered imagination was much like the cults devoted to Quetzalcoatl. In 1929, Quetzalcoatl was the protagonist of the murals that the Orozco's rival, Diego Rivera, was painting in the National Palace of Mexico City. In short, the myth of Quetzalcoatl was the best known of any of the large corpus of Aztec mythology at the time Orozco set to work on the murals. These writers and artists were attracted to Quetzalcoatl because, unique among Aztec deities, he seems to have also been a historical person. His history offers a complexity and a historical nuance completely absent from any other Aztec deity. According to sources written in the Aztec language, the man-god Quetzalcoatl had ruled in the ancient city of the Toltec peoples. Under Quetzalcoatl, the Toltec peoples had enjoyed peace and prosperity. Quetzalcoatl convinced them to give up human sacrifice, instead making offerings of birds and butterflies to their gods. But his archenemy, the fellow creator god Tezcatlipoca, schemed against him. Tezcatlipoca tricked him into humiliating himself by getting drunk and sleeping with his sister. After his downfall, Quetzalcoatl left his peoples in shame and departed towards the red lands of the east. For Orozco, Quetzalcoatl became the perfect vehicle to show that eternal struggle between the human ideal thwarted by human fallibility. A noble ruler, he falls prey to the machinations of his enemy, who leads him into vice. In Orozco's murals, we find the first entrance of Quetzalcoatl after the most terrible scene of human fallibility imaginable, that is, the ritual murder in the sacrifice scene. While this scene is psychologically disturbing, the appearance of Quetzalcoatl is not. As he raises his arms and preaches against this barbaric practice, we see him evenly framed by two temple pyramids. Here, to represent the ancient Toltec capital, Orozco looked to the city of Teotihuacan, which he thought of as a Toltec city. These pyramids are drawn directly from the one he knew firsthand, and they give Quetzalcoatl a visual prominence. They also index the high achievements of American civilization in the building of the massive pyramid and the organization of the large city. Even in the coloring, the murals employ similar red tonalities with overlays of bright blue and green as well that we find in the Teotihuacan murals. For Orozco, Quetzalcoatl stood out from other deities of the Aztec pantheon, and here he seems to push back with his upraised arms a lineup of the other deities appearing behind him. While most Mexicans of Orozco's day, like most Americans, would have not had a clue to who these deities represented, Orozco had done his homework. The deities on the walls are all very specific Aztec deities, and Orozco shows his knowledge of the history of his own country by drawing on real sculptures and paintings to represent them. The one on the left is a god named Xipe-Totec, our Lord, the Flayed One, a springtime god. He's normally shown wearing the skin of a sacrificial victim, tied in the back, as in this famous sculpture. This is one, and you can see. However, Orozco reverses the costume so as to reveal who he is. Adjacent to Xipe is Quetzalcoatl's fellow creator deity, Tezcatlipoca, the evil trickster, who joined with Quetzalcoatl to rip apart the earth. Here, Orozco has not drawn on sculpture, but instead a painted manuscript from the 16th century. It shows us Tezcatlipoca with his distinctive striped face paint there, as well as his foot, which is transformed into smoke, which is Orozco's picking up on that as well. At the right of Quetzalcoatl is the rain deity, Tlaloc, who wears a distinctive goggle-eyed mask made of twisting snakes. In the vessel at the right, excavated from the Templo Mayor, you can see the snake skin around his eyes there. Here, Tlaloc was a rain god, the bringer of lightning, and here the skies open next to him. Next in profile is the death deity, Mictlantecuhtli, and here Orozco has again turned to manuscript painting from the 16th century. We see the distinctive skeletal face with prominent jaws and teeth. In the next figure, Orozco gives us a very loose interpretation of the Aztec tribal god of Huitzilopochtli, a deity named Hummingbird of the south. And here he appears with a rather avian foot there, and also the same face paint as we find in this representation. On his head, though, is something unique to Orozco, and that's this little feathered panache, which looks like a wing. The purpose here seems to be more to create a visual rhyme across the mural between Tezcatlipoca and Huitzilopochtli, framing the figure of Quetzalcoatl. Finally, there is the deity of Huehueteotl. He's the old fire god, and he's associated with the searing fires and flames of volcanoes, and is usually sculpted in volcanic rock. He wears a heavy, flat disc-like brazier for hot coals on his head, and we can see that Orozco's picked that up there, creating a kind of visual joke by actually showing him on fire there. He merges with the body, his body merges with the great volcano that lies behind him. and flames escape from his headdress and from his hands. The following scene, after this rogues gallery of Aztec deity, brings us to the paradise of Quetzalcoatl's reign in the Toltec capital. Here, human beings flourish with abundant crops and artistry reigns. The figure on the right carves a block of stone, and again, Orozco uses real artworks to index the high idea of pre-Hispanic culture, such much as he did the carefully engineered pyramid. Here, his Indian artist is at work carving a block on which is inscribed a calendrical date. Now, the use of the calendar and the ability to mark time and predict future events was shared among pre-Hispanic peoples of Mexico, and it was one feature that observers held as marking their cultures as superior. This, in fact, is a real fragment of a known building. It's the Temple of the Feathered Serpent from a site which, again, Orozco thought was Toltec, of Xochicalco. You can see the glyph here, and there you can see our friend, the Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl's myth, of course, ends badly, and again, frailty triumphs over idealism. While Orozco does not show the events leading to his downfall, we see the people in the former paradise rising up against their god-king. Once again, Orozco uses a real building in the background, here a Maya temple from Chichen Itza. As told in the history, Quetzalcoatl leaves on a raft of serpents towards the red lands of the east. The tragic consequences are clear. In the next scene, Spanish soldiers bearing the cross of evangelization unleash the fiery wars of conquests. The once independent and happy Indians are now killed, and their bodies are piled up to the right of the conquistador Hernán Cortés. With this arrival, the modern world is ushered in, a world dominated by giant pieces of machinery in which the human presence and spirit are conspicuous by their absence. In beginning his world epic with the story of Quetzalcoatl, Orozco revealed the gravitational pull that Mexico exerted upon him. He returned to the Toltec and Aztec past because, from his early experience in Mexico, that past was actually present. What did the Aztecs mean to Orozco? In choosing to emphasize the achievements of ancient peoples in their architecture, in their knowledge of the calendar, in their ability to find satisfaction in labor, Orozco pointed to the American past as a source of inspiration to the present. In fact, through these themes, what could be a specifically Mexican history would be set as world history. So, what does this history teach us today? In his desire to create truly world history, Orozco took as his starting point the history of the Americas, but not the point north of the Rio Grande. As we move into a world where U.S. power cannot be assumed as the center, it's useful to think about the decentering and the decentering of our assumptions about where history should begin that the Orozco mural asks us to do. In the central mural of Quetzalcoatl, Orozco reminds us that history is a perpetual struggle of idealism against human frailty. Quetzalcoatl is defeated and frailty triumphs. But we must keep in mind that Quetzalcoatl also points outward, off stage, as it were, into the future. The story that Orozco tells is not over, and in the pointing figure of Quetzalcoatl, we see a reminder that the future brings something new, including hope for a new age of idealism that will bring us closer to the aspirations of Quetzalcoatl's paradise. Thank you. absolutely. Yeah, go ahead.
Considering the background that we now have on sort of nuanced view of human sacrifice in Aztec culture, how much of that would Orozco have known back in the 1920s? Is that research scholarship done already, or is that more contemporary stuff as well?
That is certainly more contemporary. Our understanding of the tonale and this kind of recycling of energy that the Aztecs saw as human sacrifice happening. But it's clear that Orozco is picking up in the representations of Aztec sacrifice by the Aztecs themselves, this idea of the world ordering event. And I was really struck when I first saw the Orozco murals for the first time today, that the sacrifice scene is, it is disturbing because the victim is upside down. But there is this sense that the person is part of that human community. It's not a disordered scene and it's not a disruptive scene. So I think Orozco, although he doesn't know the whole ideology of the tonale, he's certainly picking up something from Aztec sources that you would not find in the Spanish accounts that emphasize only the cruelty and the bloodshed. Yes, please.
In the codex with the tearing apart of the earth, around the border there were 2 sets of 13.
Yes.
What's the significance of that?
That's it. It's a calendar. And of course, the Aztecs, like other people in the pre-Hispanic world, counted bundled days into days of 13. That's a sacred number. So that's a kind of month to them. So what we're seeing is a count of the days on that, on the outside of that. So it's really a statement about the beginning of the world, which happens when Quetzalcoatl and Tezcatlipoca get together in the center, and then the days start to tick themselves off around the edge. So it's a calendar. Yeah, Mary.
I was really, I'd never thought about that relief carving in the Golden Age Argentine city. I don't know if it's I just assumed it was a kind of salivation of relief carving. And so the fact that you secured it, the Xochicalco mural, I'm just wondering, I know the mural art of the pyramid, but I don't actually know much about the inscriptions or the decorations on it. Does that dateglyph actually refer to the state of the charged one piece here, or
No. We don't know what those, I have to say, I was so proud when I figured that one out myself, too, because I don't know the Xochicalco murals very well, and I was like, wow, that looks like Xochicalco. We don't know those are very unusual, those epiclassic sites, and there hasn't been a huge amount of research to figure out what the hieroglyphic language is being used there and what it's signifying. So no, I don't think it's an 8, it's a 6 read year, no. Yes, go ahead.
I was struck by your juxtaposing human idealism and frailty, because I thought it was sort of a soft word as opposed to evil. And I wondered if that's in keeping with Orozco's views or if that's more your interpretation of the world.
Actually, that is something I borrowed from Lawrence Hurlburt, who uses that juxtaposition, which I think is a very apt one for the murals. Yeah, and I think Orozco, of course, is a secular person, and I don't think he would have thought about it in terms of evil, which is a religious term usually.
But what about the slaughter by the Spanish conquistadors?
Yes, and I think when you compare the way the human bodies and that tortured mass of flesh, which has its parallel only in something like Goya's paintings, I think Orozco is asking you to question who was really barbaric in this scene of world history. Absolutely. Yeah.
what were Orozco's religious views? Was it the same?
Well, Mary can answer that better than I, but he's an atheist, no?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, he's not very forthcoming about his views on anything, so in his written text. But he was raised Catholic and is thoroughly indoctrinated in that sort of religious Catholicism, and in the ritual and the liturgy, I'm sure. But I
I think we have a reception.